found on the beach near Galveston, Texas. It had United States Air Force markings. 2 nights later, a Los Angeles television station cut into a regular program with a special news flash. Later in the evening, the announcer said they would show the first photos of the real thing, our military's flying saucer. The photos turned out to be of the Navy XF-5U, a World War II experimental aircraft that never flew. The public was now thoroughly confused. By now, the words flying saucer were being batted around by every newspaper reporter, radio and TV newscaster, comedian, and man on the street. Some of the comments weren't complimentary, but as Theorem 1 of the publicity racket goes, it doesn't make any difference what's said as long as the name's spelled right. Early revered by so many, U.S. News and World Report threw in their lot. The UFOs belonged to the Navy. Up popped the old non-flying XF-5U again. Events drifted back to normal when Edward R. Murrow made UFOs the subject of one of his TV documentaries. He took his viewers around the U.S., talked to Kenneth Arnold, of original UFO fame, by phone and got the story of Captain Mantell's death from a reporter who was there. Sandwiched in between accounts of actual UFO sightings were the pro and con opinions of top Washington brass, scientists, and the man in the street. Even the staid New York Times, which had until now stayed out of UFO controversy, broke down and ran an editorial entitled, "Those Flying Saucers, Are They or Aren't They?" All of this activity did little to shock the military out of their dogma. They admitted that the UFO investigation really hadn't been discontinued. Any substantial reports of any unusual aerial phenomena would be processed through normal intelligence channels, they told the press. Ever since July 4, 1947, 10 days after the first flying saucer report, airline pilots had been reporting that they had seen UFOs. But the reports weren't frequent, maybe one every few months. In the spring of 1950, this changed, however, and the airline pilots began to make more and more reports, good reports. The reports went to ATIC, but they didn't receive much attention. In a few instances, there was a semblance of an investigation, but it was half-hearted. The reports reached the newspapers too, and here they received a great deal more attention. The reports were investigated and the stories checked and rechecked. When airline crews began to turn in one UFO report after another, it was difficult to believe the old hoax, hallucination, and misidentification of known objects routine. In April, May, and June of 1950, there were over 35 good reports from airline crews. One of these was a report from a Chicago and Southern crew who were flying a DC-3 from Memphis to Little Rock, Arkansas on the night of March 31st. It was an exceptionally clear night, no clouds or haze, a wonderful night to fly. At exactly 9:29 by the cockpit clock, the pilot, Jack Adams, noticed a white light off to his left. The co-pilot, G.W. Anderson, was looking at the chart, but out of the corner of his eye, he saw the pilot lean forward and look out the window, so he looked out too. He saw the light just as the pilot said, "What's that?" The co-pilot's answer was classic. "No, not one of those things." Both pilots had only recently voiced their opinions regarding the flying saucers, and they weren't complimentary. As they watched the UFO, it passed across the nose of their DC-3, and they got a fairly good look at it. Neither the pilot nor the co-pilot was positive of the object's shape because it was shadowy, but they assumed it was disc-shaped because of the circular arrangement of 8 or 10 portholes, each one glowing from a strong bluish-white light that seemed to come from the inside of whatever it was that they saw. The UFO also had a blinking white light on top, a fact that led many people to speculate that this UFO was another airliner. But this idea was squashed when it was announced that there were no other airliners in the area. The crew of the DC-3, when questioned on this possibility, were definite in their answers. If it had been another airplane, they could have read the number, seen the passengers, and darn near reached out and slugged the pilot for getting so close to them. About a month later, over northern Indiana, TWA treated all the passengers of one of their DC-3 nights to a view of a UFO that looked like a big glob of molten metal. The official answer for this incident is that the huge orange-red UFO was nothing more than the light from the many northern Indiana blast furnaces reflecting a haze layer. Could be, but the pilots say no. There were similar sightings in North Korea 2 years later, and FEAF Bomber Command had caused a shortage of blast furnaces in North Korea. UFO sightings by airline pilots always interested me as much as any type of sighting. Pilots in general should be competent observers simply because they spend a large part of their lives looking around the sky. And pilots do look. One of the first things an aviation cadet is taught is to keep your head on a swivel. In other words, keep looking around the sky. Of all the pilots, the airline pilots are the cream of this group of good observers. Possibly some second lieutenant just out of flying school could be confused by some unusual formation of ground lights, a meteor, or a star, but airline pilots have flown thousands of hours, or they wouldn't be sitting in the left seat of an airliner, and they should be familiar with a host of unusual sights. One afternoon in February 1953, I had an opportunity to further my study of UFO sightings by airline pilots. I had been out at Air Defense Command headquarters in Colorado Springs and was flying back east on a United Airlines DC-6. There weren't many passengers on the airplane that afternoon. He came strolling back through the cabin to chat. When he got to me, he sat down in the next seat. We talked a few minutes, then I asked him what he knew about flying saucers. He sort of laughed and said that a dozen people a week asked that question. But when I told him who I was and why I was interested, his attitude changed. He said that he'd never seen a UFO, but he knew a lot of pilots on United he had. One man, he told me, had seen one several years ago. He'd reported it, but he had been sloughed off like the rest. But he was so convinced that he had seen something unusual that he'd gone out and bought a Leica camera with a 155mm telephoto lens, learned how to use it, and now he carried it religiously during his flight. There was a lull in the conversation when the captain said, "Do you really want to get an opinion about flying saucers?" I said I did. "Okay," I remember his saying. "How much of a layover do you have in Chicago?" I had about 2 hours. "All right, as soon as we get to Chicago, I'll meet you at Caffarello's, across the street from the terminal building. I'll see who else is in, and I'll bring them along." I thanked him, and he went back up front. I waited around the bar at Caffarello's for an hour. I'd just about decided that he wasn't going to make it, and that I'd better get back to catch my flight to Dayton, when he and 3 other pilots came in. We got a big booth in the coffee shop because he'd called 3 more off-duty pilots who lived in Chicago, and they were coming over too. I don't remember any of the men's names because I didn't make any attempt to. This was just an informal bull session and not an official interrogation. But I really got the scoop on what airline pilots think about UFOs. First of all, they didn't pull any punches about what they thought about the Air Force and its investigation of UFO reports. One of the men got right down to the point. If I saw a flying saucer flying wingtip formation with me and could see little men waving, even if my whole load of passengers saw it, I wouldn't report it to the Air Force. Another man cut in. Remember the thing Jack Adams said he saw down by Memphis? I said I did. He reported that to the Air Force, and some red-hot character met him in Memphis on his next trip. He talked to Adams a few minutes and then told him that he'd seen a meteor. Adams felt like a fool. Hell, I know Jack Adams well, and he's the most conservative guy I know. If he said he saw something with glowing portholes, he saw something with glowing portholes, and it wasn't a meteor. Even though I didn't remember the pilots' names, I'll never forget their comments. They didn't like the way the Air Force had handled UFO reports, and I was the Air Force's Mr. Flying Saucer. As quickly as one of the pilots would set me up and bat me down, the next one grabbed me off the floor and took his turn. But I couldn't complain too much. I'd asked for it. I think that this group of 7 pilots pretty much represented the feelings of a lot of the airline pilots. They weren't wide-eyed space fans, but they and their fellow pilots had seen something, and whatever they had seen weren't hallucinations, mass hysteria, balloons, or meteors. 3 of the men at the Caffarello conference had seen UFOs, or, to use their terminology, they had seen something they couldn't identify as a known object. 2 of these men had seen odd lights closely following their airplanes at night. Both had checked and double-checked with CAA, but no other aircraft was in the area. Both admitted, however, that they hadn't seen enough to class what they'd seen as good UFO sighting. But the 3rd man had a Lulu. If I recall correctly, this pilot was flying for TWA. One day in March 1952, he, his co-pilot, and a 3rd person who was either a pilot dead hunting home or another crew member, I don't recall which, were flying a C-54 cargo airplane from Chicago to Kansas City. At about 2:30 p.m., the pilot was checking in with the CAA radio in Kirksville, Missouri, flying 500 feet on top of a solid overcast. While he was talking, he glanced out at his number 2 engine, which had been losing oil. Directly in line with it, and a few degrees above, he saw a silvery, disc-shaped object. It was too far out to get a really good look at it, yet it was close enough to be able definitely to make out the shape. The UFO held its relative position with the C-54 for 5 or 6 minutes. Then the pilot decided to do a little on-the-spot investigating himself. He started a gradual turn toward the UFO, and for about 30 seconds he was getting closer. But then the UFO began to make a left turn. It had apparently slowed down